April 20th, 1945. In Berlin, the Führer sat in his bunker celebrating a birthday he did not deserve, clinging to the illusion of armies that no longer existed. But hundreds of miles away, in the fractured landscapes of Silesia, another kind of scene unfolded. Not a parade of flags and soldiers, but a ragged procession of women moving out of a camp gate. Their steps so hesitant they seemed afraid of the very air beyond the fence. A thin layer of snow clung to the ground, half melted by the late spring sun. And the women, many of them scarcely more than shadows of themselves, looked as though they might dissolve into it. An American general, his uniform pressed though his boots were caked in mud, raised his hand as if blessing them. "You have your freedom," he said, his voice carrying both solemnity and relief. For a moment the declaration hovered like smoke over the camp. It should have been met with cheers, tears of gratitude, an exodus of joy. But instead silence thickened. The women looked at one another, their eyes hollowed by hunger and distrust. Freedom, as the word reached their ears, was not a promise but a question. Many of them had been taken years earlier, wrenched from towns in East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia, pressed into labor to feed the Reich's war machine. Some had been punished for defiance, others simply unlucky enough to be caught in the path of soldiers. They were German civilians, but treated like prisoners, catalogued and confined, their bodies reduced to labor and their names replaced with numbers. They had survived winters without firewood, meals that were little more than boiled weeds, and nights haunted by the cries of the dying. And now, suddenly, they were free, or so the general said. One woman, scarcely 30 but aged by suffering into an appearance closer to 50, tightened her shawl around her shoulders. She did not step forward. She thought of Königsberg, where she had once lived with her parents before the Soviets advanced. Rumors had reached the camp. The city burned, its name erased, its people expelled or worse. How could she go back to a place that no longer existed on any map? Another woman, barely 18, clenched her fists as though ready to run, but then stopped, remembering the stories whispered at night, of trains carrying people eastward, not homeward, into a darkness from which no letter ever came. The general's words echoed again, but they seemed to fade into the distance. Freedom, yes, but freedom to where? Behind them lay years of captivity, humiliation, hunger. Before them stretched a Germany in ruins, bombed cities where food was rationed in handfuls of flour, where children dug through rubble for firewood, and where the victors' armies brought both relief and retribution. For women whose families were scattered or annihilated, home was not a destination but a wound. Historical records from the Allied command estimate that in 1945 alone, nearly 12 million ethnic Germans were displaced from the east. Villages emptied, trains overloaded with refugees, columns trudging west in the mud and snow. These women, once captives, now found themselves part of a larger tide of dispossession. To send them back would mean delivering them into Soviet hands, where vengeance often came swiftly and brutally. Allied officers knew this, though policy demanded repatriation whenever possible. But the women knew it more keenly, through the terror etched in memory, the screams, the flames, the fields of the dead. For a viewer today, it may seem strange to imagine anyone refusing freedom. Yet the silence at that camp gate was not born of ingratitude. It was clarity. Freedom had no meaning without safety, no sweetness without the certainty of survival. To step back east was to gamble with life itself. And so, while the general's words carried the authority of victory, they fell against a wall of weary calculation. These women had learned not to trust proclamations, not to believe in promises, no matter how noble the uniform in which they were wrapped. One witness, a chaplain attached to the American unit, later recalled in his diary the haunting stillness of that moment. He wrote, "We had expected rejoicing. What we saw instead were faces frozen, not in joy, but in the terror of choice. They were offered freedom, but freedom led into a void," his words. Capture what statistics cannot, the paralysis of people asked to return to places that had vanished from the world. That silence lay the seeds of a dilemma that would preoccupy Allied officials for years. The war was ending, the camps were being opened, but what was to be done with those who could not or would not return? The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, already overwhelmed with millions of displaced persons, faced a crisis. Repatriation was the official policy, but the women at that gate stood as living contradiction. They did not want to go back. Some whispered to the soldiers, begging to be allowed to remain, offering to clean barracks, to work kitchens, anything but return eastward. It is tempting to imagine one of them stepping forward, breaking the silence with defiance. But the truth is more subtle. Their resistance was quiet, almost invisible, but no less powerful. It was in the refusal to move, the shaking of heads, the whispered "Nein." Their strength was not in a shout, but in a standstill. Against the momentum of armies and the machinery of post-war planning, they simply did not walk back through the gates. And so the general, who had spoken with the conviction of victory, found himself facing a truth harder than war, that freedom could be refused, not out of arrogance, but out of despair. His declaration, meant to close a chapter, opened instead a new and complex story. Behind him, the camp remained. Before him, the women remained too, unwilling to vanish into the ruin of their past. The spring sun sank lower, staining the horizon with crimson, and still the women lingered at the gate, their thin forms silhouetted against the wire that had once confined them. Freedom stood before them like an open road, but where roads lead, not even generals can promise. What came next would test not only their endurance, but the very meaning of liberation itself. In the spring of 1945, the word home was both the sweetest and most bitter sound to millions of Europeans. For the American general who declared freedom at the camp gates, home seemed an obvious destination. What else could the liberated want but to return? Yet for the women who listened, gaunt and shivering in the April wind, home had become a ghost. Germany was no longer the homeland they remembered. It was a land fractured, scorched, and occupied, where the idea of safety had been erased alongside the walls of their childhood houses. The Allied advance revealed a landscape of ruin. Cities like Dresden, Cologne, and Hamburg were not merely damaged, they were flattened into seas of brick dust. Berlin itself was a carcass of stone, where fires still smoldered and children lived in the shadows of collapsed buildings, scratching for coal or bread crusts. Food rationing offered civilians barely 1,000 calories a day, often less. Mothers mixed sawdust into bread dough to make loaves seem larger. Women returning from camps knew that if they reached these cities, they would trade hunger for deeper hunger, captivity for queues that wound around blocks, patience for desperation. But even hunger was not the greatest fear. For those who came from the East Prussia, Pomerania, Silesia, the word home meant a geography already erased. By war's end, nearly 12 million ethnic Germans would be expelled or forced to flee from Eastern Europe, driven out of lands their families had farmed for centuries. Soviet troops advancing through these regions left trails of vengeance that survivors dared not speak of. Houses were burned, villages cleared, civilians marched west under gunpoint. What woman would step back toward Königsberg only to find it renamed Kaliningrad, its streets patrolled by Soviet soldiers, its German inhabitants scattered to the winds? One woman at the camp gate, known in records only as Marta, 29, was offered a place on a transport back to Silesia. She refused. Her reasoning was simple. Her husband had vanished on the Eastern Front. Her parents had been killed when their town was shelled, and her childhood home had been claimed by Polish settlers under new Soviet-backed decrees. "My home," she later said to a relief worker, "is in the ground." Such statements were common, terse and final, as if the women feared that to admit grief in fuller words would shatter what strength they had left. For many, the choice to stay was not born of hope, but of dread. Allied records note instances where trains bound eastward had to be guarded, not to keep civilians inside, but to stop others from tearing their way out. Some women leapt from cars, preferring to risk the wilderness rather than return to lands where the Red Army reigned. A U.S. Army chaplain stationed in Bavaria recorded the words of one displaced woman who begged him, "Better to starve here in the shadow of your flag than to be safe there under theirs." Her plea was not romantic, but practical. Starvation, disease, uncertainty, these were survivable. Revenge was not. Yet the paradox was cruel. To refuse repatriation meant remaining stateless. These women were technically free, but without countries to claim them, classified instead as displaced persons. They lined up daily for meager rations in camps that looked too much like the prisons they had just escaped. But even there, amid the mud, the bunks, the endless paperwork of survival, there was at least one fragile gift: the knowledge that tomorrow would not be dictated by Soviet officers or by the next bombardment. It was survival stretched thin, but it was theirs. Some observers, hardened by war, mocked the women's hesitation. Allied officers, seeing their reluctance, sometimes asked, "Do you not wish to see your homeland again?" The question was well-meaning but naive. To long for home, one must believe home still exists. For many of these women, the hearth was ash, the village square was rubble, and the neighbors had become enemies. They remembered doors broken in, carts overturned, the sound of boots that brought only terror. Return was not reunion. It was exile into the familiar turned hostile. Amid these stories, humor occasionally surfaced, sharp as broken glass. A British officer once recounted how, when asked why she would not go back to her village, one German woman muttered, "Because I am fond of eating." The remark earned a bitter laugh in the barracks, though it revealed the truth more plainly than any statistic. Even gallows humor became a form of resistance, a way of asserting that survival mattered more than sentiment. By summer, reports circulated through the Allied command about the growing population of Germans refusing repatriation. The numbers alarmed policymakers, already overwhelmed by millions of refugees from across Europe: Poles, Hungarians, Ukrainians, Balts, and Jews who had survived camps. The German women's refusal added another complication to an already impossible puzzle. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration had counted over 7 million displaced Germans in 1945, each one a logistical question, each one a moral burden. How do you send people home when they insist that home is a graveyard? For the women themselves, the choice grew starker as weeks turned into months. To remain meant to live indefinitely under Allied oversight, in a limbo neither prisoner nor citizen. To go meant facing the erasure of identity, of family, of safety. In one camp in Bavaria, American guards reported that women tore up their repatriation papers, refusing to sign their names to any document that could deliver them back east. They acted, one officer wrote, as though to sign their name was to sign their death. Through these small acts of refusal, a new identity emerged, not as German nationals returning to ruins, but as displaced women forging existence out of nothing. Some began working within the camps, cooking in communal kitchens, sewing uniforms for soldiers, teaching children whose parents had not survived. They became their own fragile society, a society bound not by geography but by survival and the shared conviction that the past could not be reclaimed. It is easy, decades later, to frame these decisions as mere practicality, but at the time, each refusal carried the weight of defiance, a silent stand against the tide of history that sought to sweep them back into suffering. The women had endured years of captivity, humiliation, and hunger. Now, when offered freedom defined by a return to devastation, they chose instead the uncertainty of exile. It was not hope that fueled their decision, but the raw clarity that survival sometimes means never going home. And yet, refusing home was not the end of their ordeal. In many ways, it was the beginning of a longer, quieter battle, one fought not with guns or armies, but with time, with bureaucracy, with the slow erosion of patience. For while they had defied the call of ruin, what awaited them in the months ahead was a different kind of captivity, one without fences, but no less confining. What came next would test not only their endurance, but their very definition of freedom. By the summer of 1945, the war had ended, but the women who refused to go home were still trapped in the geography of aftermath. The barbed wire fences of the labor camps were cut down, but new fences went up around what the Allies called displaced persons centers. To the soldiers who guarded them, these were way stations of mercy. To the women inside, they often felt like prisons with softer walls. Freedom had been declared, but it came with watchtowers and ration cards, forms and inspections. The camps sprawled across the Allied zones in Germany, Austria, and Italy, hastily assembled in abandoned barracks, schools, even concentration camps repurposed under new command. Dachau, once a site of horror, became a DP camp housing not only liberated Jews, but also Poles, Ukrainians, and Germans who had nowhere else to go. Inside, lives intermingled uneasily, the guilty and the innocent, victims and the heirs of perpetrators. The German women who had refused repatriation now stood among them, their presence a complication in the fragile balance of relief and retribution. The daily rhythm was one of survival in paperwork. Each morning brought lines at the distribution sheds, where U.S. Army trucks delivered sacks of flour, tins of Spam, powdered milk. A woman would sign her name or mark an X, proving she was still there, still hungry, still unclaimed by any nation. Allied officers filed reports with grim precision. Rations delivered, barracks occupied, medical cases treated. Numbers told a story of efficiency, but inside the wooden huts another story unfolded. Coughs echoed at night. Babies cried from hunger. Lice spread in the straw bedding. Yet even in such conditions, a kind of life returned. Women who had once labored in fields or factories now cooked in communal kitchens, stirring great iron pots of watery stew. Others mended clothes, patched boots, or scrubbed laundry against wooden boards until their hands bled. Some taught letters to children who scratched chalk across slates salvaged from ruins. These tasks gave a shape to days that might otherwise collapse under the weight of uncertainty. Work was not freedom, but it was a fragile thread tying them to survival. Statistics captured the enormity. In 1945 alone, Allied records counted over 7 million displaced Germans. Some would be sent back, many against their will, to lands now claimed by Poland or the Soviet Union. Others lingered in the camps for years. One American officer complained in his report that the Germans wished to stay where they are rather than face the chaos to the east. To him, it was stubbornness. To the women, it was sanity. In the barracks, whispered stories circulated about what awaited those who returned. A woman from Pomerania told of her sister, who had gone back with her children only to be expelled weeks later by Polish soldiers. Another recounted the fate of neighbors forced onto trains eastward, never heard from again. Truth and rumor blurred, but the effect was the same. Each tale hardened resolve. Better to endure the monotony of camp life than to vanish into the silence of vanished borders. Occasionally, humor pierced the despair. A British relief worker once wrote that when asked why she preferred camp life, one German woman replied, "At least here, I know which army feeds me." It was a line that drew nervous laughter, a reminder that even in exile, irony could survive. Such remarks were small acts of defiance, a way of asserting choice where choice had been stripped away. Yet the camps were not havens of solidarity. Tensions simmered among different groups. Poles who despised Germans, Jews who resented sharing space with those they saw as complicit, Allied guards who distrusted everyone. Fights broke out over food, over space, over insults spoken in languages few could understand. For the German women, shame was an added burden. They were branded not as victims, but as the people of the defeated enemy, tolerated but never fully trusted. An American chaplain recorded a conversation with one young woman who said, "We are too guilty to go home, too hated to stay, and too alive to die." Her words distilled the paradox of existence between camps and countries. For many women, relationships became a strategy for survival. Some worked as cleaners or cooks for Allied soldiers, trading labor for extra rations. Others formed bonds, fragile or lasting, with men who had once been enemies. Marriages were not uncommon. To marry an American or a Briton was to gain a chance at a future, perhaps even a passage to another continent. But such choices carried their own stigma. Fellow camp residents sometimes whispered that these women had bartered dignity for bread. Survival always carried a cost. The bureaucracy of freedom pressed down heavily. Papers had to be filled, identity cards issued, interviews conducted to determine origin and intent. Some women gave false names, hoping to escape forced repatriation. Others deliberately left blanks on forms, refusing to write the names of towns they would never see again. To the Allied clerks, these omissions were obstacles. To the women, they were shields. A name was a claim, and to claim a vanished home was to risk being sent back to it. Despite the bleakness, there were moments of renewal. Children born in the camps became symbols of endurance. Photographs show infants swaddled in Red Cross blankets, their mothers looking on with tired but defiant eyes. These babies were stateless, born in limbo, but they represented a stubborn declaration that life could continue. One relief nurse wrote in her diary, "They have nothing, and yet they bring forth life." It is the most political act imaginable. By 1946, it was clear that many of the displaced would not and could not return. Policy began to shift. The United States, Canada, and Australia opened limited immigration quotas. Churches and relief agencies sponsored resettlements. Some women seized these opportunities, boarding ships to new continents where the word home could be rebuilt from nothing. Others remained in camps year after year, their lives stretching into a purgatory of waiting. For every departure, dozens stayed behind, unwilling to risk the unknown but unable to reclaim the past. The image of the general at the camp gate declaring freedom seemed far away now. Freedom had not brought doors flung open, but corridors of paperwork and years of limbo. For the women caught between camps and countries, liberation was not a single moment but an ongoing negotiation with fate. Their refusal to return home had spared them from one kind of destruction, but it had delivered them into another. A life measured by ration cards, queue numbers, and the uncertain mercy of foreign governments. And yet, within this fragile existence, a new truth began to emerge. These women were no longer prisoners, nor were they citizens. They were something else, something that defied categories. They were survivors suspended between worlds, bound together not by borders but by resilience. Their future was uncharted, their choices narrow, but they had chosen. They had said no to ruin, even if it meant yes to uncertainty. What awaited them beyond the camps remained unclear. For some, it would be a ship sailing westward. For others, years more of waiting. But one fact was certain. The meaning of freedom had changed forever. It was no longer about return, but about survival. And what these women would do next would not only shape their lives, but also the fragile future of a continent trying to heal. By 1947, the war had been over for 2 years. Yet for thousands of German women, the word after had not truly begun. They remained in the displaced persons camps scattered across Europe, suspended in a limbo that was neither captivity nor freedom. Their refusal to return east had spared them the terror of vengeance and expulsion, but it had not delivered them into belonging. They lived instead in the gray zone of the unwanted, where nations debated their futures while their lives unfolded day by day inside barbed wire perimeters. The women had learned to make routines from the fragments of exile. Each morning, smoke curled from the chimneys of camp kitchens where watery porridge simmered in iron pots. Laundry lines stretched across courtyards, heavy with patched garments washed again and again until the fabric thinned to threads. Children played with toys fashioned from wood scraps and tin cans, their laughter startling against the silence of their mothers' faces. Photographs from the period show women staring at the camera with eyes that held both endurance and emptiness, their expressions asking questions no policy paper could answer. Some found slivers of renewal in the smallest acts. A group of women in one Bavarian camp started a sewing circle, not merely to mend clothes, but to create dresses for children who would grow up without a nation. In another camp, makeshift schools opened, where women who had once worked as teachers resumed their vocation, chalking letters onto broken blackboards salvaged from ruins. Even amid hunger, they passed on language, arithmetic, and fragments of songs remembered from better times. These efforts were not grand gestures, but they were defiance against the slow erasure of exile. But limbo had its price. Many of the women remained legally classified as enemy nationals, a label that clung to them even as the war faded into memory. Relief workers noted the bitterness that accompanied their status. They were not victims in the eyes of the world, nor were they recognized as refugees deserving sympathy. Instead, They hovered in the margins, defined less by who they were than by what they had lost. To carry a German identity in 1947 was to carry a burden heavier than rations or suitcases. It meant suspicion, stigma, and silence. For some, escape came in the form of marriage. Allied soldiers stationed near the camps sometimes courted women, drawn by beauty, companionship, or perhaps the allure of rescuing someone from limbo. These unions offered a path out, a chance at papers, a ship's passage, a new life in a country where the future was not a question mark. Yet they were not simple solutions. Within the camps, whispers followed such brides, accusations of betrayal or desperation. Survival required choices that dignity did not always bless. Still, for those who boarded ships to America, Canada, or Australia, the gamble meant a chance to redefine home. Others clung to the idea of return, not to the east, but to the western zones of Germany where the ruins were at least familiar. By 1950, West Germany was absorbing millions of displaced people, and the women who once refused to go back east now faced a different question: how to integrate into a society that often viewed them as strangers, reminders of a dark past. Many resettled in towns where rubble still lined the streets, taking jobs as maids, factory workers, or farmhands. They built new lives from fragments, though often at the cost of burying their stories. To speak of refusal, of exile, was to invite suspicion. Silence became a shield and memory a private burden, yet history records that not all stayed silent. In the archives of the International Refugee Organization are testimonies from women who explained why they had chosen exile over return. Their voices are steady, matter-of-fact, even blunt. One wrote, "I would rather die without a flag than live under one that destroys me." Another declared, "Freedom is not to go back. Freedom is to remain alive." These testimonies reveal the clarity of their decisions, choices shaped not by ideology, but by the elemental instinct to survive. The irony of their plight was never lost on them. They had been offered freedom, but freedom without a homeland is an emptiness difficult to endure. One relief worker observed that many women described themselves as free prisoners, a phrase that seemed absurd yet perfectly true. They could leave the camp gates, but there was nowhere to walk that did not lead to rejection, suspicion, or the ache of loss. The world beyond the fences was open, but it did not open for them. Still, life pressed forward. Babies born in the camps grew into toddlers who spoke their first words not in villages or cities, but in huts stamped with Allied insignias. These children, stateless and uncertain, became living symbols of resilience. Mothers who once despaired now held futures in their arms, fragile yet undeniable. Photographs of such scenes, infants cradled against women wrapped in threadbare shawls, circulated in relief agency reports. Evidence that even in exile, life refused to be extinguished. By the end of the 1940s, the great tide of displaced persons began to ebb. Some were resettled abroad, others absorbed into West Germany, others still faded into anonymity, their names lost in lists and ledgers. But for those women who had stood at the camp gates in 1945 and refused to go home, their story lingered as a quiet testament. They had chosen uncertainty over ruin, exile over destruction. In their refusal, they redefined what it meant to be free, not a return to what was lost, but the courage to survive without it. And so, the image of the general at the gate lingers, his words echoing across years. "You have your freedom." At the time, it was a declaration of triumph, the language of victors. Yet for the women, it was a sentence heavy with paradox. Freedom was not a road back, but a road that led nowhere mapped. They walked it anyway, not because it promised safety or belonging, but because it allowed them to live. History often celebrates the grand decisions of leaders, the signing of treaties, the movements of armies. But here, in the hushed defiance of women who said no to return, lies another kind of courage. It is quieter, less visible, yet no less transformative. Their story is not one of banners or battlefields, but of endurance in the shadows, of survival in the cracks of history. For them, freedom meant the freedom of nowhere. And yet, within that nowhere, they carved the fragile beginnings of lives that continued, stubborn and unyielding, long after the ruins of war had faded into memory. What they left unspoken still hangs in the silence of history, a question that cannot be answered by generals or governments, but only by us. When home is gone, what does freedom truly mean?